The next assembly we're going to discuss is the Hersey Model 1. Hersey Model 1 is a double check assembly produced from 1950 to about 1978. Rubber parts and hardware parts are still in production and still available for this model because Hersey uses the same basic construction in some of their current model designs of water meters that they sell. But the Hersey Model 1 was produced in sizes 2 through 10 inch, and they also had a 10 by 12, which means it had a 10-inch body with a 12-inch inlet and outlet flange with just 10-inch guts on the inside. The Model 1 was simply two single checks that were bolted next to each other and put through the approval process by Hersey. Hersey, being a meter manufacturer, produced detector checks and single checks. Well, this was their Model DC single check that they utilized in single checks and detector checks, bolted the two together and sent it through the approval process. And here's what the parts look like inside the assembly. The one footnote about this assembly was that it was a weight-loaded, not a spring-loaded type of a check mechanism. So there was no mechanical spring, but just by placing a heavy weighted material in here, it was actually lead that was encapsulated in a bronze weight holder. And they also put lead inside the check disassembly holder. There were small areas of lead that were exposed to the water passageway, and some places have had them replaced because of that small area of lead. But the Hersey Model 1, two Model DC checks bolted together. Let's go ahead and see what it looks like inside. This being a 2-inch, which was bronze. The other sizes 3 through 10 were a galvanized cast iron body. I want to show you the cover first of all, because this is what confused a lot of people. If you close up in on this serial number you'll see on here, what it will say is Hersey detector check Model DC. This is not a Model DC double check backflow assembly like a lot of people thought. It was a Hersey Model 1. But you'll notice nowhere on this tag does it say Model 1. Hersey built the detector check Model DC, which is what DC stood for, detector check. And they would put a 7-digit serial number like you see here. This is 5039626. And that was the serial number for each single check that came through. Many times underneath that 7-digit serial number, you would see a number of digits, any number from 3 to 7, however many they'd punch in there. This would be a model number that they would apply to the backflow assembly, or sometimes a meter number that would be applied by the meter company. Then there was the size listed here where you see the 2. So Hersey would say Model WDC, and it would be a 7-digit number. The reason I'm showing you that 7-digit number because on the 3 and 4 inch, I had to have that 7-digit number to see if you had an old or a new style. This one is serial number 503 is the first 3 numbers. If the serial number began with the first 3 numbers of 523, you have to be careful. You need all 7 digits because 5231063 was the cutoff between the old style and the new style in the 3 and 4 inch. So reading the tag was very important. And unfortunately, like many tags, they were held on by little rivets and the tag would fall off and now you'd have no way of identifying it. Well, if you had a 3 and 4 inch, that would be quite a problem. Hopefully the paperwork had the number on there for you. So once you've taken the cover off, what you're going to see on the outside of the body are 2 plugs on both sides, on this side and on the other side. One plug missing over here already and the second plug here. And looking inside the check assembly, what you're going to see is a counterweight, and underneath it you're going to see a disc holder. So what you're looking at is this. There is a disc holder on the seat here on this set of bushings, and a counterweight sits on top on this set. So as the check assembly goes to open, the check assembly opens, rolls the roller arm across the weight, and closes like this. So it was a loaded check, but without a spring loading. So disassembling it, you'd have to take the 2 bolts plugs off here and 2 plugs on this side, remove the spindle, which would bring out the weight arm, second set of plugs, and you would drive out the check assembly like this. This being a 2-inch, this being a 3-inch version. I wanted to show it to you. Check seats were threaded into the body and were replaceable on the larger sizes. Let's go ahead and take a look at the disc holder first. Look on the 3-inch, it's a little easier to see. Now, in today's issues with lead, there was a lead-loaded weight. In other words, this was a hollow piece of bronze that they would fill up with lead here and also back here. So there was a small amount of exposed lead in the water passageway on this design. Many of the water district's problems with lead and copper rules have eliminated the ones that had exposed lead. This one's partially exposed. Anyway, to rebuild the check assembly, one nut on the front comes off. take the nut off, your disc retainer plate, your check disc. Underneath the disc holder would be a small O-ring, which I'm trying to get out right there, that would sit on the inlet side of the stem, right there. Disc retain holder, check bolt. The other part on the back side would be your roller, making sure you had good movement on the roller. If not, you could disassemble it, remove the E-ring, take this nut out, and go ahead and clean that, but usually you want to make sure you had movement. All that roller did was slid across this little area through here, so you wanted to make sure that was clean also. There were a Bakelite or a very hardened plastic bushing in here, and the purpose for that bushing was so that this pin, which slid through there, had a relatively frictionless turning. So you can see the black bushing in there. If the bushing was cracked or broken out, it would have to be replaced. Otherwise, it would just be a matter of driving out the pin to put it back together, just like that. So, relief the weight, just a matter of cleaning if anything was on it, usually wiping it off. Since it was bronze, there wasn't a lot of issues. Check assembly. Assembly bolt in first. Disc holder. Stem O-ring. Now the disc. And as I said earlier, with the serial number 5231063, would mean there were two different versions. Here's two of the 4-inch. The new version being here on your left, the old version being on your right. You can tell the difference in rubber parts are not interchangeable, so that's why it was important to have the serial number. So put the rubber disc in, disc retainer, put our nut on top. On the older versions, there would be a cotter key that sat through this castle nut. On the newer versions, it was a Loctite type of a nut that went through the assembly. Reassembling is going to be just the reverse. We're going to install our disc holder first. Go ahead and have our pin ready to go in. Catch the stem protruding through the body. And as you can see in there, want to make sure we have movement of the disc holder just like this. Once we have the disc holder in place, now I want to put the counterweight back on top, driving my pin from inside here. Just like that. Now I want to make sure I have movement of my weight. Once I have my two components back in, check goes back on top. Notice that there is an air bleed on the top. That's to bleed air out of the cover. Right there, air bleed on top. Reassembling. And this is the single Hersey Model DC, which was used as a detector check, but when two of them were bolted together, became the Hersey Model 1. Next assembly we're going to discuss from Hersey is the Hersey Model E1. The Model E1, like the Model 1, was a valve that Hersey produced by bolting two check valves next to each other, sent it through the approval process for approval. It was produced from about 1975 to about 1978. Very small amount of production, very limited in scope that it was distributed. It did use a lead weight loaded check mechanism. It had a single pin cover rather than the double pin like we saw in the Hersey Model 1 series. But the lead was completely encapsulated on this version and was not open to the water passageway. So the Hersey Model E1, rubber parts have been discontinued. Let's take a look and see what the check assembly looks like. Take a look at what it looks like. Again, instead of having two drive pins, two separate pieces of a weight and a disc holder, the Hersey E1 was a single component. So there was only one pin that held the check into the body. Remove the plug, dried the pin, the check assembly came out in one piece. Now, like the Model 1, it was a weight-loaded double check. Here's a bronze casting, but you notice this time they put a brass plug on the top side so the lead was not exposed. They completely limited the exposure of lead by encapsulating it completely inside the bronze body. And once I had the weight mechanism out, to rebuild it, one bolt held the disc into the disc holder into one piece. Reassembly was just the reverse. Putting it back into the body was a matter of lining up one spindle, driving the spindle through, putting my two plugs on the outside inside the body. Cover gasket was on the top, and that's our Hersey Model E1. Next assembly we're going to discuss is the Hersey Model HDC. This is a double check assembly that was produced in sizes 3/4 through 2 inch. Rubber parts are no longer available. Hardware parts have been discontinued and are limited to stock on hand. It should look pretty familiar to most of us because it's the standard Y-pattern poppet style double check that about 5 other manufacturers produced over the years also. Hersey had a lot of different double checks they produced, the FDC, the F72, and some other models they had in small sizes. And this was their way of coming up with a more economical to produce double check assembly in small sizes, 3/4 to 2. So yes, it looks exactly like some models we're used to seeing, produced for a short period of time. Rubber parts are no longer available, so it's pretty much a footnote valve. Take a look and see what it looks like inside. Here's a cutaway of a 3/4 inch. To disassemble it, cover comes off first, O-ring cover on the top, check spring, disc holder, check seats were cast in the body and were not replaceable. But this is what the model HDC Hersey double check looked like. The BAVCO model VC, we're back to the BAVCO name, so this is one of their older generation assemblies. Production began late 50s, about 58, produced till about 74-ish, 75-ish. Double check assembly. Bronze body construction. Rubber parts are still available for this particular unit, so it can be repaired. Had to be removed from the line for the proper repair of this particular assembly. So to rebuild it, the bolt had to be dropped from the flanges. The whole backflow assembly was dropped out of the piping configuration and taken apart in its construction. There were 2 basic types of construction. The 2-inch was one design and the 3 and 4 inch were another one. Here's a 2-inch one where it had a flanged bolted body. They also made a screwed threaded body, which I'll show you in just a second. And the 3 and 4 inch, which were a flanged body construction. And again, both 2 through 4 inch all had to be removed from the piping system for a proper repair and disassembly. I want to show you a unique version of the model VC that Hersey did produce, the BAVCO and the BAVCO VC. And it was this particular 3 and 4 inch VC that they produced, but notice what they did on the downside of the number 2 check. They actually drilled and tapped it and placed a 2-inch vacuum breaker. They used the model SMR, model 714 vacuum breaker head. What this gave them was a 2-check pressure vacuum breaker. In the old days, 2 inches and above, there was no type of vacuum breaker like today for that particular application. And the manufacturer says, why can't we just put a vacuum breaker head on the larger sizes, and that should work properly to give us a pressure vacuum breaker in the larger sizes, meaning 2.5 through 10. Well, they did some back siphonage tests and they found out that this was not enough area to break the vacuum on the larger sizes. So the 2-check pressure vacuum breaker was produced by several manufacturers over the years. Not too many left out in the field anymore. They've pretty much all been removed. But if you ever run across one, here's a 2-check PVB, what that looks like. So I want to show you what the model VC looks like, the 2-inch size, both the bolted and threaded body, and the 3 and 4 inch, which was only an embodied version. Let's go ahead and take them apart and take a look inside. Yeah, I've got a 2-inch here on the table, and this is the model that were most commonly made. There was an earlier generation, which I'll show you in a minute, but let me show you the common one first. You can see it had unions on both ends, had to be disconnected and removed from the piping. In other words, it was not inline repairable. So we'd shut off the gate valves back then, break 2 unions and drop this whole body out. Once we dropped the body out, the check assemblies were flanged together, removing all of the bolts, would release the spring tension for the check. Like this. Check body would come out in one piece, gasket in the middle, spring, disc holder. One nut would hold the disc into the disc retainer. Seat was cast in the body and was not repairable. Now, as I said, this was the common version that you saw, which was gasketed in the middle. So once I break it out of the body, it was fairly easy to take apart. The oldest version of the 2-inch is the one I want to show you because that was the one that caused the most problem. And this was made in the early years of the production of the VC. And this is what it looked like, was like this. Now, unlike the later version where it was flanged together, this one was threaded together. And so after I broke the unions and dropped it out, now I had to get a 48-inch pipe wrench to go ahead and take this body apart. As you can see, that's about a 3-inch thread right there that we had to unscrew to move the body apart. It was not a gasket or O-ring seal, so unfortunately it required torque in order to seal that check assembly. Check assembly looked very similar, seat cast in the body, but the real problem was this body. And what would happen is you'd need a 40-inch pipe wrench to get enough torque to get that apart. And unfortunately, what happened over the years is sometimes these bodies got warped when people were sitting there with large pipe wrenches trying to unscrew it. So the earliest version had a threaded body like you see here. The more common version had a bolted body, and that's the one that you see here. One nut to replace the disc, have our check assembly into the seat, spring, go ahead and mount our body like this, bolts through, line up our test cocks, and this is our 2-inch model VC. So here I have a single check of a 3-inch, the inlet first number 1 check valve for a VC. Second check will be bolted on the end over here. When you go to repair it, shut off both shutoffs, drop both checks down, separate. You have to separate both checks at the flange right here. This being the first check. To disassemble it, what you're going to see is this piece on the back side of the inlet check, and obviously on the outlet side of the number 2 check, outlet side of both checks, is this small little spanner area. Piece of metal can get in there to untwist it. Sometimes a small little chisel, slight tapping will remove it. This retainer is in here loose. It's not tightened down. It doesn't have a water seal or anything like that. All it is a positioning piece, the spring retainer inside the body. So once I unthread it, out comes my spring retainer, my spring, and my disc holder like this. One nut holds the disc into the disc holder. The check seats are cast into the body and are not replaceable. Reassembly is going to be just the reverse. Take the nut off, replace my check disc, reinstall my disc holder, my spring retainer has to be tightened down. It has to be taken down to the point where it will be flush with the flange. Obviously, there has to be a flange gasket across here, so all it has to go down is below the flange level. Once I have it below there like that, that will be a proper seal. This doesn't have to be tightened in. It doesn't work any better if that's tightened in as long as below the flange level. This is the first check. I would rebuild the second check, bolt it back together. Both 3 and 4-inch were bronze body units, so there was a relatively easy maintenance, meaning not a lot of removal of debris inside the body because it was non-ferrous. Bolt it together, plop it back in, and that was my BAVCO Model VC.